Hi, my name is Vera Coster, and I'm going to speak a little bit about addiction. And just to introduce myself, I'm one of the addiction counselors at the Thorpe Recovery Centre out in Blackfoot, Alberta, just outside of Lloydminster. And so if people are from around this area, you would probably know where we are. We're just right off the highway, just about 10 kilometers outside of Lloyd. If you're listening to this from somewhere else in the province or in Canada, then you may want to look at a map to see where we're located. We are a residential addiction treatment center. We treat adults with substance and process addictions, and we have approximately 72 beds, of which 48 are residential treatment program beds, 12 beds are detox beds, and we also have an intensive wing where we run some of our specialty programs, such as a family program and a children's intensive for children and families of loved ones who struggle with addiction. So I'm going to start this presentation by just talking briefly about, first of all, when I speak about substance use, I refer to substances such as drugs and alcohol. And if I do refer to process addiction, we generally tend to talk about gambling, gaming disorder, sex addiction. It could be exercise or shopping. So for substance addiction, people tend to get addicted to a specific substance, such as alcohol, cocaine, heroin, and for process addictions, people get addicted to the process of engaging in a behavior. So first off, I'm going to talk about the stages of substance use, or maybe better even to talk about how a person gets from non-use to the place where substance use has become problematic. So we can look at this on a continuum. And so the first phase is really non-use, so not touching anything at all, being completely abstinent from all mind and mood altering substances. And then next, we come to the second piece, which is experimental use. And so this is where people maybe try out of curiosity, try a substance. Maybe they see their friends or other people partake in something, and so they might try it out, and they decide, this was an okay experience, or maybe they just right off the bat decide that this is not for them. This is how they base some of the decisions going forward on. And although maybe nothing happens at this time or never will happen in the future, experimental use can still be very harmful, because a person doesn't know exactly what is going to happen to them if they take this substance or engage a certain behavior. And so the consequences of engaging in this or taking the substance are unknown. So it could very likely be that a person who might try, let's say, an opiate for the first time, doesn't know what the dosages are, has heard that friends or people they know might be partaking in some recreational fentanyl use, so to speak, and they will take the substance and they could very easily overdose and die. So the harm there is quite significant. And then we get to the third phase, so we call this the social or recreational use phase, where a person might seek out and use to enhance social occasions. So rather than just going to the party and having a bit conversation and hanging out with people and engaging in conversation and connection with friends, they are going to this party and they have a little bit of alcohol or maybe some pot or whatever substance may be available in order to relax, to fit in, and to heighten that social connection experience. Or for some people, it's really that recreational use where, on a Saturday night, once in a while, they might want to go and smoke a joint. But it's not at this point a problematic or regular use even. So from there, the next phase would be regular use. So this is when the use or the engagement in the behavior has become more of a normal part of the person's life. And so it's, there's not much thought given to whether they're going to maybe have that beer at the end of the day when they come home. They just come home, put their lunch kit down, they go to the fridge, they open the beer, and that's how the evening starts. So whether it's one beer through 2, 3, 4, but the engaging in drinking behavior is a normal part of their daily experience, the way maybe having a cup of coffee in the morning would be. And so it's, and sometimes people then will find when use has become regular, they may find that they struggle to actually see, well, if this is a party that at a person's house or a get together where maybe people won't be engaging in drinking, and it's just maybe meeting up for coffee or meeting up for tea, or maybe there's other people that don't engage in drinking or drugging behavior, and so they might actually end up deciding, I'm not going to go to this because there won't be any substances that I can partake in, and so they might make choices against certain social or recreational connections because of the absence or the inability to participate in substance use at that time. And so this is often actually also the stage where we see a bit of a tolerance begin to happen, where what used to be 1 or 2 beers in the evening now becomes 3, 4, 5, and just to achieve the same kind of relaxation that was previously achieved with 1 or 2 beers, or even a dependence that at the end of the day or at some point during the day there needs to be the use of a substance in order to be okay. So when there is no ability to actually obtain liquor, or they've run out, that they may actually start to feel a little bit unwell or irritated, frustrated, anxious, and so there's a dependence that's starting to develop. And from here, from regular use to the final part of the continuum, the problematic use, which is stage 5, where the person has really crossed over that line into problematic usage of substances or engaging in problematic behaviors, to the point where there's negative effects from the substance use. So and the negative effects from the substance use are not necessarily because the person is physically negatively affected, although that is a huge part of it. But we look also at the different kinds of ways that substance use or engagement in addictive behavior is affecting the person's life. And so we look at social, biological, psychological, and spiritual aspects of how addiction or problematic use, however you want to term it, affects the person. And so, and it is this is where the tolerance has developed, where maybe a case of beer is not enough anymore. It's got to be more than that, or where beer just won't do the trick anymore, and the person has to drink hard liquor, where they're definitely experiencing withdrawal symptoms. So maybe even having to have a drink to steady the nerves, steady the hands, become functional in the morning in order to possibly go to work if work is still in the picture, or just to be able to get out of bed. And some people, wake up in the middle of the night, have to take a drink just to go back to bed and to ward off those withdrawal symptoms. So, and I guess what I really want to also point out for this is that the lines in between, or the kind of the flow chart on this continuum from going from one stage to the next, the lines are often very fine and almost invisible. And so it is very easy from somebody to go from social recreational use to regular use and problematic use in not a long time and without a lot of warning. So I just want people to be aware of that. So just to be aware of what kind of warning signs are available to observe, either for the person that is impacted, personally living in addiction, being the one that's addicted, or being in problematic substance use, or people around the person can maybe observe some of these warning signs being present. So we look at hazardous use. So hazardous use would be something that is, maybe being willing to drink and drive. So in order to be able to go pick up some more liquor at the liquor store because the risk of running out or actually having run out. And so the willingness to put their own lives and the lives of other people on the line in order to obtain more liquor, going to a place where drugs are being sold, where it's often an unsafe situation, engaging with people where their safety is not guaranteed. But being willing to take any of these risks in order to maintain and to obtain substances that are required for staying in addiction. Social interpersonal problems. So here we're looking at, how are the social and interpersonal relationships affected? How are people withdrawing from their friends? Is there partnership problems? Is there, maybe there's some conflict at the job where there's somebody is more irritated because they're in the middle of their withdrawal from their substance, and so they start to get into arguments with their coworkers. There's all sorts of ways that social relationships, interpersonal relationships, can be negatively affected by substance use. So this is a big warning sign too when a person starts to edge on in their relationships. We've already talked a little bit about withdrawal, so I just want to highlight a little bit that withdrawal is a significant piece of substance use, and part of the reason why people continuously re-engage in substance use because of the risk of withdrawal and how uncomfortable and in certain cases actually life-threatening withdrawal can be. So some of the hardest substances to withdraw from where withdrawal can be life-threatening are actually alcohol and benzodiazepines. And so there is really, really high seizure risk. And with seizure risk or seizures comes the risk of dying. Some of the other withdrawals that we know are very, very difficult, maybe not quite as high as in regard to life-threatening from a physical standpoint, but the feeling that comes along with the withdrawal feels like the person might be dying. So for example, opiate withdrawal is very, very physically difficult. It is like the worst flu somebody has ever had, and that maybe that exponential and 10 times the worst flu they've ever had. And so the fear of going into withdrawal for a lot of people who are opiate dependent actually maintains the continued engagement in addiction. Tolerance, we talked about that, needing 1 beer, 2 beers, now suddenly needing some beer and some vodka, essentially just, progressing through larger quantities and then in higher potency, maybe, using combinations of drugs and alcohol or different substances in order to get more of an effect because one or the other is not doing the trick anymore. Using larger amounts for longer times. So the person is engaging in substance use and is now not stopping at up 2 or 3 beers, but they're drinking the whole case. And they're also possibly, the intention being, we're just going to have a little bit of something just for Friday night. And next thing they know, it's Sunday afternoon and they're still engaging in substance use. Or they're going to call in the early night and then they're crawling into bed in the wee hours in the morning because they were unable to stop using when they had initially intended to. Another warning sign are the repeated attempts to control the use or to quit using. So, controlling use would maybe be trying to only, and if you could see me, I'm doing quotation marks here, only smoke some pot or only drink some beer. But instead of maybe using cocaine or other hard drugs or, drinking beer instead of hard liquor, it's, the idea that I'm only going to go out and take $20 with me and I'm going to leave all my credit cards and all my bank cards and anything else at home so that I can't spend anymore. But then going to the bar and running a tab or, for drug users, it's not uncommon to go front things from the dealer. We know that is often, people end up having debts with people, with buyers, because they get, so to speak, loans with a promise to pay. Or really, going on the wagon, and not using and really trying really hard, and but then unable to stay quit, so to speak. So that on Monday morning after a particularly rough weekend, and then they find out that by Thursday they just can't stay stopped, and so they will re-engage in addictive in substance use. Physical and psychological problems. So any of the physical problems, substance use often has pretty severe physical consequences for people. There's all the internal problems that can happen with organ damage, liver damage, and even physical problems as a result of falling, getting into physical altercations. And then we also have the psychological problems. So people often end up with substance-induced mental health issues, or using substances because they have pre-existing mental health issues, and so getting into the substance use in order to somehow deal with some of the mental health stuff that's coming up for them. Activities given up, and so this is a big one. This is where somebody may be really engaged in community activities, going to the gym, playing hockey after work, or softball in the summer, have active social life and things they like to do with friends or their families, and suddenly addiction takes priority, and so there goes the hockey. And then there goes the participation in, maybe they don't go skateboarding at the skate park anymore. Maybe they don't want to go run training anymore. And they used to be, somebody who really enjoyed going for a jog or for a run. Maybe there goes the bowling league, or any of those activities that people used to enjoy doing are now falling by the wayside, because more and more time and more preoccupation is happening for the addicted person. And so there's not a lot of room left to have any other activities. Cravings. So for the layperson, I try to explain this in a sense that if you've ever had a really, really strong craving, either for coffee or, for some of you who might be smokers but don't use any other substances, that feeling, you really need a cigarette. And for people who don't use anything, and, think about when you really, really wanted a chocolate, and that thought is, preoccupying you, and you're thinking about the chocolate, and you're salivating a little bit about the chocolate, and you can't wait to go and either have that chocolate ice cream or the chocolate bar from the corner store. I guess you can tell that I'm from Ontario. We call them corner stores, so there's that absolute need where the body is physically, psychologically longing, craving that substance, that the brain can't really think and focus on anything else. And it seems in that moment that that's all that matters, is finding that substance and getting that into the body. Or for somebody to go to the casino and put some money into the machine, go play the tables, or whatever other process addiction, gaming, might be happening for the person. And then last but definitely not least, the neglect of major roles and responsibilities. This is where we're looking at where, somebody is, maybe you have a responsibility as a parent, and suddenly you're not being that parent to your children. The inability to fulfill certain roles to the best of your ability because it's compromised by substance use. For siblings, where the older sibling might have been really helpful around the house, or tutoring the younger siblings, or supervising homework, or just being able to be left alone and being the babysitter for the younger siblings. But now that person is in the grips of their own addiction, whether it's gaming or whether it's substance use. And so they can't be trusted anymore to actually fulfill these major roles. So these are also a version this is when those of you who have heard of the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, and we're in version 5 at this time. So these are also the criteria that people look at. So how many of these criteria does a person present with? And according to that, we diagnose people, or people get diagnosed with mild, moderate, or severe addiction for a specific substance. So next year, you're going to watch a brief video. It's Eggs on Weed, and it's just a really good video that is helpful to remember how much pot smoking, I'm just going to call it by that, is going to impact somebody's ability to make appropriate judgments. So have a look. Some of you might have seen this before, and then I will continue with the lecture. So now that you've seen that video, we come to this slide, and it says addiction and the brain. And so a really important part of talking about addiction, I think, is to talk about what we historically have known about how people with addiction have been perceived by society. So for a long time, people who suffer with addiction have been stigmatized by being thought of as lesser citizens, lesser people that are lazy, that they're bad people because people make bad decisions when they're in the midst of substance abuse, and so people that are just somewhere at the bottom of society and cast aside, beyond help, and for a long time, because there wasn't enough understanding about addiction, this is what society thought often about what was happening for people who were in the grips of alcohol substance addiction. And so thankfully, we know a lot more today. We've had quite a lot of progress in this field. And so as the medical field has done more research, and we have come to understand that addiction is actually located in the brain. So one of the classifiers, and I'm not going to bore you to death with all the classifiers and the people that we need to have in order for something to be classified as a disease, but one of the classifiers in order for it to be classified as a disease is that it has to affect a major organ. And so medicine, or so studies and the advances in medicine have come about in being able to figure out that addiction lives in the brain. And so the definition by the American Society of Addiction Medicine, ASAM for short, has defines addiction as a primary chronic disease of the brain reward circuitry, motivation, memory, and related systems. And so in a nutshell, it affects everything in the brain, and it affects how a person seeks reward. It affects motivation for the person. It affects the memory aspect, and it also affects how memories are formed, which is a huge principle in the learning principles in addiction, how a person learns to re-engage a certain behavior because there's a certain reward tied to that behavior or that substance, and all the systems that are related to that. So from here, I'm going to talk a little bit about what one of the neurochemicals that is very, very involved in addiction. And so most people will have heard of dopamine. And so I'm going to just talk about how dopamine is involved in addiction. And we're going to watch a video after this as well. But I want people to see on the left-hand side, you have the control group. So generally when we talk about a control group, we talk about a group of people that is not experiencing the experimental thing that is being tested or is not being given a drug. So these are people that are in their normal state. These are healthy, functional brains that show a healthy amount of dopamine activity. Okay, so this is the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we see brains that are under the influence of certain substances. So the top one is cocaine, the next one is methamphetamines, underneath that is alcohol, and at the very bottom, heroin. And so the decrease can be seen over how over the use of a person has been using for a certain amount of time is how those brains have changed with the use of these substances. And if I usually do this, I do a little spiel when I do this presentation with an actual live audience. And so I explain it this way, that we all have a certain base amount of dopamine in our healthy brains. And and everybody varies a little bit, but generally we have a certain amount of dopamine and dopamine receptors available to us. And so as we engage in normal daily activities, the brain produces amounts of dopamine that signal certain rewards about certain behaviors or substances. So let's say somebody eats a really good chocolate bar. Now, when I ask this to a live audience, I always get Kit Kat. For some reason, people believe that Kit Kat is one of the best chocolate bars. I would personally actually say it's an O. Henry bar, so I'm going to go with O. Henry. So when I know I'm going to go eat an O. Henry bar, I'm going to have this O. Henry bar, from my regular level of dopamine, my brain might actually come up with like a 40% increased, or like a 40 above my normal of dopamine for the amount of time that it takes for me to eat this O. Henry bar, and then my brain simmers down again and comes back to its normal, regular, balanced state. And then a really good supper, most people will say it's steak and lobster or something like that. So if you think about having a steak and lobster supper, you're really excited about this, you're going to your favorite restaurant, and so your brain's already kind of engaged in producing more dopamine just thinking about this awesome supper you're going to have. And so you're already having a bit of an extra piece of dopamine, like an amount of dopamine being released. And next thing, then you're going to have this supper. It's so good, just as good, maybe even better than you had thought it would be. So your brain maybe produces 80 above normal for dopamine. And then after the supper, as you come back down, you're still kind of full and satiated after the supper, but your dopamine comes back down to your balanced level. So for adults that are listening to this, I would say that, for people, for healthy adults, maybe engaging in consensual healthy sex would be 120 above regular dopamine. And then, coming back down to our base level. Now, if somebody is engaging in substance use, let's say somebody takes cocaine, they would get approximately, maybe, give or take, about 600 above their normal dopamine level. And that is how much dopamine might be available for them in that synaptic cleft where the dopamine receptors are. So this is way more dopamine than can be naturally ever produced by the body. Somebody with a crystal meth dependence, 1100 to 1200 above their base level of dopamine. So the brain's dopamine reward circuitry gets hijacked by the substance use. So I'm hoping that this kind of explains how addiction, how rewarding addictive behavior, how rewarding substances are. And so when a person gets sober and they stop using, their brain has stopped producing its regular healthy levels of dopamine because it's been under this artificial influx of dopamine for whatever amount of time. And so when a person gets sober, they actually don't have what they used to have as a base level dopamine production. they'll be somewhere below it. So what used to be really, rewarding, and that O. Henry bar and that lobster and steak supper and, healthy sexual activity is not as rewarding anymore. Maybe half of what it used to be, until their brains rebalance themselves and heal and actually go back to normal functioning. So here is a video that explains a little bit how this happens and what it looks like in the brain. And so I'm going to come back to the presentation once you've watched the video. So what I'm going to show you now is actually some slides on what the brain looks like. So these are SPECT images. And what you see is not exactly what the actual photo from the brain would look like, but these are images of a healthy brain with healthy, fully symmetrical activity. So the left image is a top-down view, and the right image is bottom-up view. And so we're seeing a healthy brain that has activity all over. If you click on the next slide, the left slide is a left frontal stroke. So what we see, and it looks kind of like somebody's taken a bit of a bite out of the brain, but it's actually not actually pieces of the brain that are missing, but activity that has stopped working. So there is chunks of the brain that have been impacted by the left frontal stroke that signify that these areas of the brain are no longer functional. Now, if you compare that to the right-hand side, so that is an image of a 37-year-old person with a 17-year habit of heavy weekend drinking. So that is, again, not pieces of the brain that are missing, but actual parts of the brain that have stopped functioning normal. So the activity levels there don't register anymore on a SPECT image. Our next images, if you keep on clicking, or if I don't know exactly if this presentation is just going to slide through, or if you have to click buttons, but this one here is on the left-hand side, a brain under the influence of alcohol, and on the right-hand side is a brain under the influence of heroin. So these are images of how the brain under longer term use has been impacted. And so the next slide here is a 20-year-old person with a 2-year history of a cocaine abuse. On the left-hand side, it's the top-down view, and the right-hand side is the bottom-up view. So, as we know, with the legalization of marijuana, we're seeing, not that it hasn't been used widely beforehand, but I think it is really important that people are quite aware that as much as it's become legalized, it is still a problem. It's still a substance that people get addicted to, and we actually see quite a lot of people come into treatment specifically for marijuana addiction. So, it is not as harmless as people like to think. So on the left-hand side, we see a healthy brain again. And on the right-hand side, we see an 18-year-old person who daily uses pot. So we are seeing the beginning stages of how the brain is impacted. So the next slide here shows just different perspectives of a 25-year-old person who smokes daily pot, or smokes pot daily, and so you see on all perspectives of these images how the marijuana has begun to affect this person's brain. And so just so we can also see that, it's not just substances, but people who are addicted to process addictions. Again, gaming is a big one, gambling, shopping, exercise, if it's, to the point where it becomes addictive, sex addiction. So on the left-hand side, we see the healthy brain. On the right-hand side, we see a brain that is impacted by process addiction. Now, when a person comes into treatment, they're usually Some people come with a couple of days or a couple of weeks and sometimes a couple of months of sobriety when they come into treatment. But a lot of people literally come to us and they have maybe 24 hours sober, maybe a couple of days, and some people come in still under the influence. So you have seen a whole lot of examples of what their brains look like from the active substance use. So when they come into treatment with us, they are actually, their brains are not in any way completely functional at that point. So their decision making, their emotional capacity, their psychological abilities have all been compromised by substance use. And that is something that we really, look at when we engage with people and we ask them to participate in program, and their brains are still heavily impacted by the recent substance use. But then there is hope. So if you look at the next slide here, and it says that, this is 1 year of abstinence. So if you look at this, and you see the left hand side, the top down view, how much a brain has already been able to heal itself after 1 year of complete abstinence. So that means no drugs, no alcohol, no nothing. And so the healing process can begin and has actually progressed quite nicely. And on the right-hand side is just the bottom-up view. So the miraculous part of the human brain is that the brain can heal itself if it is allowed, and if substance use is halted, and the brain is given the opportunity and the time to heal. I want to talk a little bit about, the genetics and the personal experience piece. And so we look at, and most people I think are aware that there's a bit of a genetic component to addiction, which by no means means that a person who has relatives that are addicted or have been addicted in the past, that is, so to speak, a sentence or, a foregone conclusion that person will end up in addiction, but it means that their likelihood is increased, that they at some point in their lifetime will develop the addiction. So a person who has a grandparent has a 4 times increased likelihood of developing an addiction in their lifetime. And a person who has a direct parent that struggles with addiction or has struggled with addiction in the past has an 8 times greater chance of developing addiction in their lifetime. But we also know that genes are necessary but not sufficient for a person to get addicted or develop addiction in their lifetime. So we look at something having to be a contributing factor. So this is kind of where something happens that turns that gene on. And we look often as that something being an overwhelming, stressful, oftentimes traumatic event that happens to a person that switches that gene on, where suddenly, addiction, substance use, process addiction becomes a way of coping with whatever the situation, the circumstances were that overwhelmed the person's coping mechanism. So if you click onto the next slide, the stress response here. And so there is, we look at people having stress responses. So a healthy way of going through the stress response is really, there's a stressful event. In this case, the person encounters a dinosaur. Whoops, our fight, flight, or freeze instinct kicks in. I choose to run because I'm not so sure if this dinosaur is going to eat me or if he's going to be friendly. So my body kicks in with the hormones and the energy and the endorphins and everything that I need in order to run away and get myself to safety. And as soon as I can establish safety, my parasympathetic nervous system will kick in and will actually quiet down that physiological reaction I had, so that my body calms back down and gets to a steady state again, and I can go about my business and not be overwhelmed and stay in that heightened stress response. What happens, though, when somebody is in a traumatic experience, when their system is overwhelmed by a situation, is that the stress response doesn't complete. So they stay in that heightened level of arousal. So this is kind of where, people with a PTSD diagnosis, often struggle, is that their response to everyday life and, circumstances, a lot of times they're not able to, to regulate anymore, and they're always in that heightened stress response. So this is a form of, switching on that gene. And the person is more susceptible to developing addiction. The good news, though, is that there are a lot of protective factors that can help people not develop addiction, or actually prevent, if they have been in addiction and they have found recovery and are abstinent and have changed their lives enough that they don't need to use anymore, and they have found that freedom that recovery brings, so they engage in healthy behaviors and healthy connection with other people that helps them prevent relapse. So we always talk about healthy connection, so closely bonded relationships with loved ones and friends. It's all about connection, good self-esteem, and a sense of identity, feeling good about the person they are, and being okay being who they are. And skills to cope with difficult feelings. So life is not easy all the time. Life is not always fair. And it's really important to develop some healthy coping skills. So to be able to go through some of these difficult times, and to know that, there are resources out there to help, to ask for help, to ask loved ones, to go to a counselor, to seek that support that we need in order to get through our lives in a healthy way. So I absolutely love this, and I always talk to the clients at the Thorpe Center about this. The opposite of addiction is connection. So if we are able to connect, we are able to combat addiction. And so it's with that, I'm going to ask you to watch the next video. It's a very, very important video. And I hope that you got something out of this slide presentation. I hope that it was not too much information, but just enough, and that it was a little bit interesting. And if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to ask questions, to get more information. Contact your local healthcare providers. Seek out more information. There's also to help out there, and people that are willing to lend a helping hand. So thank you very much for your time, and I will leave you with this video.